couple of people joining now, which is fantastic. So let's get started with some of the tips then. By the way, if you've got any questions at all you want to ask about the conflict and tension or the Germany paper for tomorrow, then feel free to ask away on the chat. So first of all, first question in conflict and tension will be the 4-mark question. It will be, this source opposes something or supports something. How do you know? Explain your answer using source A and your contextual knowledge. So you shouldn't be looking to spend too long on this type of question, just about 5 minutes or so. And really, you need to basically use a mixture of what you can see in the source and also make sure that you use your contextual knowledge to back up what you're saying as well. So the model answer, I will share it, hopefully. Let's see if we can do this. So we might even start a question and answer as well. So let's go with which paper would you like me to cover for tomorrow? Conflict and tension or Germany? Okay. Okay, so this is the first live stream that I've done before. So like I said, if you've got any feedback you want to give, if you've got any questions you want to ask about the Germany paper or the conflict and tension paper for tomorrow, feel free. We'll probably be doing this for about sort of 10 or so minutes. So question 1, conflict and tension, is all about a source opposing or supporting something. How do you know? Explain your answer using the source, probably called source A, and your own contextual knowledge. So it's broken down into 2 different levels for this type of question. So level 1, it's just a simple analysis of the source. You might only use the content of the source. You can also use the provenance of the source as well. So background information about where the source comes from, who made the source. You might only just do that without using your own contextual knowledge, or you might just use your own contextual knowledge and not use the provenance or the content of the source. That will normally cap you at level 1, and you might only achieve 1 or 2 marks out of 4 for that. So you really need to make sure that in the 5 minutes you have available, that you use your own contextual knowledge and also use the content of the source or the provenance of the source. Well, and if you do that, you'll achieve 3 or 4 marks, most of the time 4 marks out of 4 for that question. So that's conflict and tension, question 1 covered. So question 2. Question 2 is the usefulness question. It's worth 12 marks. So you want to be looking to spend about 15 minutes on this type of question, and you'll be given 2 sources, 2 different sources than you would be asked to look at for question 1. And you want to spend, like I said, about 15 minutes. I would really recommend for this type of question just focusing on why the sources are useful. Definitely don't say that either the sources are not useful. You don't want to do that at all for either of the 2 sources that you're given. And to be honest, I wouldn't really even spend much time talking about the limitations of the sources either. I'd really spend most of your time writing about the reasons why both sources are useful. Now, the best answers will also make it clear to what extent you think the sources are useful. So, for example, you might say source A is really useful, source B is quite useful, and give reasons why. But like I said, try and focus on reasons why the sources are useful rather than not useful. And how are you going to go about doing this? Well, you want to go about writing reasons to do with your own, well, you need to use your own knowledge, first of all, to back up why what you can see in the sources are useful to a certain extent. You also want to reference the provenance of the sources. Again, the background of the sources, who made the sources, the dates of the sources. You know, you can write potentially about the usefulness in terms of whether they're a primary or a secondary source, but I wouldn't really reference the nature too much of the sources. It's more in terms of the origins of the sources. So who it was that was writing about them or drawing the pictures if they're cartoons as well. So second question, usefulness question. Top tips for that type of question are focus on the usefulness, reference the provenance of both the sources and also the content as well. and give really nuanced judgments about why you think both sources are useful to whatever extent you think they might be. So that's question 2 in conflict and tension covered. Question 3 is a question that often catches a lot of students out, and it's the write an account question. So this question is worth 8 marks. You want to be looking to spend about 10 to 12 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes on this type of question. Thanks, Liv, for your question about the failures of the League of Nations. I can talk about that in a moment as well. That's not a problem, especially in the sort of 1930s. I can talk a little bit about Manchuria, and I can talk about Abyssinia as well. So we'll cover the 4 questions, and then we'll talk a little bit about the failures of the League too. So question 3, the narrative question. You really want to focus on writing in a chronological order. So as the question suggests, writing a narrative, you don't want to start at the end of the time period that you're being asked about. Most of the time in the conflict and tension paper with the narrative question, you'll be given a time period to write about. Now, you don't want to start off at the end of the time period. You definitely don't want to write about what happens outside of that time period. So rule number 1, write chronologically. Rule number 2, make sure that you stick to the time period that you're given in the question, and try and be as accurate as possible with the evidence that you're using in your answer. So try and be really accurate and try to use dates if you can. You know, a lot of students say that they often find it really difficult to remember dates. If you're unsure, put a C in front of the date. A big tip for all your history papers: if you can't quite remember the exact date that something happens, you know, it could be the exact month or the exact year, what I would do, and what I strongly recommend, is put a C in front of the approximate date. So if something happens, for example, it could be the Corfu crisis. If you put a C and 1920, you will be awarded marks positively for doing that, because C stands for circa, it means approximately, and you can pick up marks for that. So just to recap, top tips for question 3, conflict and tension: make sure you write chronologically, make sure that you stick to the time period in question, and use lots of accurate evidence and own knowledge for that type of question as well. And you can pick up really high marks. So moving on now to the 16-mark question, the highest mark question in the conflict and tension paper. So my main tips for the 16-mark question in conflict and tension are to make sure that if you've practiced writing the 16-mark question first, that you do that in the assessment as well. Make sure that you reference in probably your first paragraph, if you can, the factor in the question. Don't forget to do that. A lot of students will write excellent answers but not reference the factor that you're given in the question itself. So make sure you do that, I would recommend, in your first paragraph. Make sure as well, to get those top marks, so high level 4 marks for this type of question, that you constantly have a consistent line of argument throughout your answer. Now, students will often weigh up 2 or 3 different factors, and it's not until the end of the answer that the marker will see what their final judgment actually is. But the best answers for the 16-mark questions will often have interim conclusions or mini judgments at the end of paragraphs, referencing what the person writing it thinks all the way through their answer, in terms of whether the factor given to you in the question is the most important or maybe not. So make sure you do that if you're aiming for those really high marks out of 16, those level 4 marks. And finally, make sure that you, as I've referenced already, give yourself plenty of time to answer this question. If you're answering it first, you know, that's absolutely fine. You know, if you can, stick to the 20-minute time frame that you've got to answer this question. If you don't know any dates, will it be detrimental to your grade? I would say, would it be detrimental to your grade? You would have to use a lot of other types of evidence. And the other types of evidence that I often recommend for students are statistics, people, and events. Now, if you just use statistics, people, and events without dates, especially in your 16-mark answer, you can still achieve a really high grade. However, the marker who is reading your answer would be more inclined to give you a really secure mark if you include dates as well as those other pieces of evidence. So statistics, names of people and events. So in answer to your question, it can do. Okay, it can do. It depends if you use an abundance and lots of other types of evidence in your answer. So I've spoken about those 4 types of questions now for the conflict and tension paper. So in terms of failures of the League of Nations, well, there were some failures to a certain extent in the 1920s in terms of the Vilna crisis between Poland and Lithuania. That's one example that you might want to look to write about. Now, this type of question could be asked of you either in the write an account question or the 16-mark question. So there's some useful, or they're the most likely questions where you might need to use some examples of failures of the League of Nations. So the Vilna crisis is one. Another crisis or another failure of the League of Nations, potentially the Corfu crisis in terms of looking at the League of Nations and its fairness towards countries. You could reference Corfu crisis, although having said that, it didn't lead to war. It did lead to a peaceful outcome. The main 2, however, I would say in terms of failures of the League of Nations are the Manchurian crisis, which starts in 1931 and leads essentially to Japan taking over Manchuria and then attacking China itself. And the League really looks weak and toothless as a result of this. And it's the first sort of main example where countries look at the League of Nations and think, you're not really fit for purpose in the 1930s. So the Manchurian crisis is a major setback for the League of Nations. And then the Abyssinian crisis between Italy and Abyssinia, or present-day Ethiopia, in the mid-1930s, where Italy is looking to become more expansionist. Mussolini is trying to distract the Italian people from the effects of the Great Depression, and he sees Ethiopia as a potentially easy target to add more land to the Italian empire. So ultimately, the League doesn't deal with this very effectively. There is a secret deal that's made between Britain and France. So League Council members acting outside of the League of Nations, basically attempting to create the Hua-Laval Pact, which essentially gives Mussolini the most fertile and wealthiest land in Abyssinia. And then Abyssinia is really sort of left with nothing. However, the pact is leaked to the British press, and Hua and Laval are forced to resign, and Britain and France look really quite ineffective, and the League looks ineffective as well because it's got key members creating deals outside of the League of Nations. So both the Manchurian crisis and the Abyssinian crisis, I would say, are the main examples of failures of the League of Nations. And then I would say you could also potentially use examples from appeasement as well, which I know is a slightly separate topic within the conflict and tension paper, but you can use some of the examples of appeasement to also add to your answer on any sorts of failures of the League of Nations. So I hope you enjoyed this live session from Mr Manley, history teacher, about conflict and tension paper. Fortunately, I haven't quite got time to cover the Germany paper today, but best of luck for everyone in your conflict and tension or Germany paper tomorrow.